today what we're going to be doing is looking at how to render shadows that are cast out on the ground near an object. All right. So let's say I have some object, and I'm going to just draw in a little cylinder here. And there is light that is shining down on this object. So on the side away from that light, there is going to be a shadow that is, you'll see, on the object itself. And I'm going to have a little bit of reflected light in here, so to sort of leave a little bit of a margin here. But out on the ground here, that's what I'm really interested in today, is what's going to be going on the ground there. So if my light is coming from a little bit behind, it's going to be casting a shadow out towards me. Right? If the light is coming from the side here, it is going to be casting a shadow out this direction. All right? And if the light comes from this direction, a little bit on here, it would cast a shadow out in this direction. So what I want to do is just first notice that this shadow that is cast towards me is going to appear more broad than this one that is cast out at the side. And that's for the same reason that when you are looking at a flower, let's draw some crosshairs through the middle of this flower here, the petal that is coming towards you, you see as its full width, but it appears shorter. The petal that's sticking out to the side appears as a narrower petal. That same phenomenon would be going on. You'd imagine these just as petals. If this cylinder was sitting on top of a flower, the one that would be going out to the side would appear more narrow. So there's going to be, depending on the direction of that, a change in its the thickness of it that we see on our paper. Now, but then the question is, how far out do I make it? That's going to change with the angle of the light. If the light, of course, is coming straight down on it, I'm going to encourage people not to use that little annotate feature that is on our, there we go. It appears on everybody's screen. I think at some point I'll get clever and disable that. But let's not use that, because I think it will distract other people. It shows up not just on your screen, but on the screens of everybody who's watching. So if the light is coming straight down, there's going to be no shadow. As the light angle changes, the shadow will get longer and longer. So a good way to think about that, light rays coming in from the sun are coming in parallel, and some light ray is going to just hit the corner of this, and you continue on down in the same direction. That's going to show you how far down that shadow is going to go. So let's say I had another object that was right here. Sitting out there. And it also had a shadow. That would be, if light comes down here at an angle like that, that means light would come down at an angle like that off of that one, giving this object here a shadow that is going to be this big. And this one, a shadow that is going to be that big. So what that does is it puts the same light on all of your objects. So if a part of defining this form, it's a common light source. This is a really useful thing. Imagine that you are drawing, here's a boulder. I'm just making a random shape here, all right? And if light, let's say it has an upper surface that's there, just drawing in some.
Would you adjust your screen there? Just slide it up a little bit.
All right. So if there's light coming down on this object like this, that is going to cast shadow out to there. And that means I want the shadow that is sticking out underneath my boulder to be out like that. That light coming down at that same angle would then put this surface in shadow, casting a little bit of a shadow out on there. And if it's coming from the back a little bit, maybe part of this side is in partial light. This surface down here that is pointing down in shadow again. But look at this, here's this angle of the light. This shadow is going to be really right in there. Shadows also can give you a sense of the position of different objects relative to each other in space. So if I am drawing, if I have an object here, and I have another object, actually I'm going to put this one across here. So I have two objects. Oh, I'm doing the same thing again, Melinda. Sorry about that. I'll try to watch that. All right, so here's thing one and thing two, all right? Object one, and here's object two. And I will put a little shadow on this one. And this one down here gets a little shadow. But what make this little there. Oh. So now I have my two objects. Thing one and thing two, that's right. So this object here, thing one, can cast its shadow onto thing two. And when you get these cast shadows in, they go across onto another object, it really helps people connect these visually in space. So this object back here, shadows across a, let's say I had a pipe. Let me kind of go right here. I'll stick a pipe in the ground right next to this rock. Actually, I'll put it in right. Yeah, right there will do. So if light were coming down across that, you might get this shadow coming up across here. Where it hits this change in plane here, the direction of the shadow would change. So directions of shadows, if there's a shadow that is going across some object, the direction of that shadow will change as the as you go across different planes on a surface. On a flat object, they'll change right where you kind of come to an angle in an object. But on something that is rounded, they're going to curve across the surface. So that's saying that the shadow from this one can cast down this way right across here. And you'll see this a lot when you start looking for it. You start drawing, say, tree branches. You'll see shadows cast across the trunk from other branches in the tree, across a trunk or another branch. And you start to include these, and they are really going to add a lot of definition and form to your object. So, and if the object is pointing in a different direction, say I have another object that's pointing another way, it can even be out of the picture plane. I'm going to have another shadow here. I'm going to curve it across this. There's a shadow from a different branch curving around that is even, that's somewhere up here off of the picture plane. So if you include both objects, the thing that is casting the shadow and the shadow in your drawing, you have to pay attention to what are the positions in those in space. You don't have to make it up. You're just looking at your tree, right? But if this other branch that casts the shadow is out of your picture, you can put this shadow in curving around here any direction you want, because it will be coming from, you know, some branch that you turn the angle of that branch that's out of your picture plane, and it'll change the direction and the orientation of this on here. So those cast shadows can do a lot to kind of carve the planes of an object. I find it's really hard to make them up like I'm trying to do here. As a matter of fact, I strongly suspect if I get in here and carefully analyze this, I probably made a mistake in kind of the way that that angle should have turned. So rather than making them up, I look for places where there are real cast shadows on objects that are in front of me. And then I look for how those, let's say there's an object that the rock here has a little step down, you'd see a change in the angle of that shadow as it goes across that object. So looking at real shadows as they are moving across your object are going to be very, very useful. These are shadows from objects that have a little bit of height. Oh, actually, here's one other thing, just a note on shadows. If you're doing a shadow that is on an object, that often gets, as you're seeing here, reflected light. But if you're doing a cast shadow down here on the ground, very often there's no reflected light in there. You'll often see these shadows as being really, really dark. So expect to see some nice dark cast shadows on real objects that you're looking at. And you punch those in, right? Ah, yeah. So Carolyn is just pointing out to me, can I borrow this for a second? That this little girl here, she's going to have a nice dark cast shadow behind her here. Thank you. So now what I'm going to do is change the angle, or not the change, I'm going to change the height of the cast shadow. And actually, first I just want to look at a real object here and notice something about its cast shadow. This cast shadow is really dull and diffuse. The reason that it's really dull and diffuse is that I'm sitting inside a building, and even though I don't have artificial light on right now, I have diffuse light coming in through multiple windows. And that diffuse light through the windows gives me this fuzzy shadow here. If I am, so if I were drawing this, so this was, oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Carolyn. Carolyn just pointed out I'm drawing it in a place that you can't see it. Everybody say, thank you, Carolyn. All right, so if I had my object here, and you can give it a little bit of of height. You can give it a little bit of just a little boost by, I'm going to put in a little shadow right in here. And then coming out this way, more of a diffuse shadow, and I'm just lightening that up as I get further away from it. But generally, as it tucks in against the object, it's getting darker. And the more that you are, like this area in here, this area right in here, the more that you're kind of tucked into there, that's where I'm going to punch that shadow just a little bit. But if I want to make this, if I want to make this, and then it will have its kind of diffuse shadow over this part, diffuse shadow over here. If I want to make it look like it's out in natural sunlight, then I'm going to see that it is going to have a very sharp edge. And I punch that in. And then I'd see the same thing on this object here. I'm going to put in a sharper shadow right here, and perhaps I would see that in here. Actually, I think I would see more of into the cone. You will get these kind of crisp shadows on your object. So look for kind of crisp shadows on the object and a crisp edge shadow on the ground. So these kinds of shadows, when there is direct sunlight, can be a little bit more challenging to render because the edges of them very clearly define planes in the object, right? So you have to be very intentionally observe those. I have a hard time making these sort of things up out of my head. When I'm looking at a real object on the ground, though, let's see. Hold on, I'm just figuring out how to erase some of those marks.
Yeah, Jack, we can turn off the annotation in the settings.
Oh, that'd be terrific. So if you're just making something up, diffuse shadows are your friends, right? But if you are really rendering something as you're seeing it, you're out in the Sierra Nevada, there's bold sunlight on a boulder, you want to draw that. Really look for the shape of the shadows, both on the subject and on the ground, and look for how those might go across another object in the shape that those make. So fuzzy versus crisp. Now, notice the shadow of my pencil. We see none, and okay, that's not going to be very helpful. Okay, we can see it a little bit. All right, note, you see that sort of diffuse shadow of my pencil? Notice that the shadow doesn't connect with where my pencil's up here, my shadow is down below that. As I bring my pencil down and contact the paper, now I have a spot of shadow right where my pencil contacts the paper. And the further that my pencil gets away from the paper, the more difficult it is to see that shadow. Can you see that? So here's that floating shadow down there and contact. So bearing that in mind, I can make it look like, so again, the general rule of thumb there is the further you are away from the object, the further the shadows be. Where it touches, you actually come down. Let's say you are making a drawing of a feather that you found. I'm going to draw in a kind of light feather here. So here's where my shaft is. And it's going to have a web that's narrower out on that side. It's going to have a broader web on this side. There's going to be a zone down here of some sort of fluffy feather parts. Very often, the part of the feather down in close to the base of the quill here, there's fewer barbules in this area, and this part of the feather can be kind of fluffy, so that's going to be my fluffy zone. The feathers, by the way, there'll be an angle to the web here, the little barbs of the web here. So I just got a few placeholders for those. Now, here is my feather. So I'm going to draw just a light line coming up this way, getting increasingly dotty. And out this way, I have putting in a few kind of dotted lines, suggesting these sort of fluffy line, dot, dot. So my line comes out, dot, 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 dot. And then we're getting into a little bit of the edge of the feather. I'm going to break that line, just a few dots right there. Come along. Here is a crack in it, following the angle that a vein crack would be. And then coming in here, all right, maybe a couple places just put in a little indication that this is the direction of the sheet of the feather. I want to draw this feather as if it is sitting on top of my paper. I want it to be sitting on top of my piece of paper. So my friend here is going to be a cast shadow. And so I'm going to have light coming in from this side. And I'm going to have a cast shadow on this side. Now, if I do it this way with my object, like some of you have a computer program and it has a drop shadow effect on it. What the drop shadow effect does is it just takes an image of your feather and it moves it down this way and makes it grayed out. So if I have an object like this, and I just have an image of that a little bit more grayed out, offset, and that is shaded in, I kind of get the feeling that this object is floating above the paper. But I want this to actually be in contact with the paper. So if one end is my object, all right? If one end actually comes down and touches, you get a feeling that this is a place where my object actually has made contact with the surface here. So if this tip of the shaft of the feather has come down and it is and it's resting on the paper, then the tip of the shadow is going to connect with the shadow there. See, if I had this out like this and I put the shadow over here, it would have been floating. But I put it here because I want the tip of this to be on the ground. Now, I'm going to have just lightly gray this out from there. And if I want this tip to be on the ground, then the shadow is going to come down to it again. That would be a shadow, that the feather that's kind of arcing up.
Jack, I have someone asking what the direction of the light is, if you could put that.
So light would be coming from, you're looking from behind the light here. Light is coming down at an angle. All right, so coming in from this side and down. All right, you can then kind of just strengthen the shadow a little bit closer towards the object. You see how this shadow looks like it is making contact here and making contact over here. If I want this end to be off the ground, then what I would do is I would do this floating effect. I would float that shadow out here. And there you're seeing the edge of that feather kind of floating up off the ground, right? So you get to control where the edges, or sort of what is resting on the ground. And that makes a big difference sort of in your shadow. I'm going to erase this and just demonstrate this with watercolor now. Palette. And I am going to go for my Daniel Smith Shadow Violet. First, give my brush just a couple of wipes on my sock. Brand new sock here. Very exciting day. And my Shadow Violet is in here. And that's sort of a purplish gray color, a good sort of just generic. So this time I'm gonna put this out here. I have this floating off the ground. And I'm gonna connect it the other end up in there. And if I want to feel like the light is coming more down this way, I might even extend this out a little bit. This gives me a little sense of, there is that, that object floating in there. Might strengthen the shadow here, strengthen here just a little bit. I don't want to get fussy. Okay. So this is fun to do on a feather. It's really fun to do on a bug. So if you have an insect picture in your journal, so we're going to just block in just a quick little insect here. So I'm going to give myself a little oval. Oops, we have to stay in the frame here. My insect gets a head, a thorax, an abdomen. Maybe give it a little bit longer abdomen here. So some kind of a cool beetle. I'm going to make this a long antennaed beetle here. All right. So generally in the center of the wings, there's a tiny little triangle where the two pieces of the wing come together. Here's the seam down the side of those. Try to kind of keep these guys symmetrical. I want that side to be roughly the same size as those, as that one. It really shows up as being kind of off if I don't do that. Here's little eyes. And this might be a cerambycid, a long-horned wood-boring beetle. I love finding these things out in the woods. Now, I'm going to put legs on it. A lot of us have learned in school that the legs of an insect attach to the thorax. That's that middle segment there. That's correct. But the problem is that what happens is then most people will draw their legs attaching to the thorax. And that's incorrect, because what you don't see is that behind the scenes here, there's a projection of the thorax that comes down underneath the body here that these back legs attach to. So the back legs, they are technically attached to the thorax, but from a point back down in here. So my leg will come out looking like they are attached to the abdomen. All right, and so there is this other leg. And this leg here, going to come out here, one segment thick, next segment coming down smaller, then the next one even smaller. The final segment, if you kind of magnify these, they're actually made up of a lot of little pieces, like the antennae are made out of little pieces. So this bottom part isn't one segment, it's several little tarsal segments. And entomologists really get into counting those, because the number of tarsal segments that you get on different families of beetles is a really useful cue to figuring out which kind of beetle you're looking at. So thick, medium, thin coming out. All right. Now I'll just put these in. Here is and I'm going to give this one a few little tarsal segments here. And if I make the legs all symmetrical to each other, it'll look very much like a scientific illustration or a pinned bud. So I'm going to take this leg and I'm going to move it back a little bit in here. So and let's see, then I'm going to put this leg stretching out forward. Just so it looks a little bit less like a pinned bud. If you're doing a formal scientific illustration, you're actually being really careful to keep all the legs in exactly the same position as you go up. Now, light is going to be coming from this side onto my beetle friend here. And so I am going to put that in. Now, I'm going to have cast shadow of the body on this leg here and here and here. All right, now I want to put in the shadow underneath my beetle. And how am I going to go about doing that? Well, again, if light is coming down from this direction, I'm just going to use that same sort of thought of my body. If the light is coming this direction, then my body shadow is going to be shifted down. So that point is going to be coming down to here. And the head will then be there. So that's going to give me sort of my general body shadow is going to be coming into this zone here. Right. So I'm going to put that in. I'm going to make it a little bit stronger, especially towards the core of the body here. And now my legs and antenna need shadows. So those two antennae, those are going to be held off the ground. So that antenna coming out here, it is going to be off the ground there. And that other one would be starting in here and coming up somewhere in there. But the legs are touching the ground. So the whole tarsal segment lays along the ground. So that all rests on the ground. So its leg makes contact here. And so from this point, I'm going to bring my shadow up and into the body.
Or can you slide it?
Oh, yeah, that's, sorry. So this part of the body, this whole part is on the ground. So the leg is going to go from there into the body. This whole part here is on the ground, and then the shadow is going to come there. That whole part is on the ground, and then the shadow can be in there. This whole part, this head, and so you see, I'm making contact with the ground here and then bringing that into my body. And now you can make your insect be, you can paint on top of the shadows on the insect. I'm going to make this into a little orange beetle. You see that those shadows show through. That's also going to help you differentiate between what is shadow and what is beetle. Thanks, Sam. All right. There we go. So I like putting those shadows again so that they come down and they touch where the leg is going to make contact with the ground. And if it's entirely off the ground, then it's entirely off the ground. That's some fun bug shadows. So this insect looks fairly dull because it is all, there's no bright highlight on it. If I want to turn this into a red-brown shiny beetle, I'm going to up the contrast between make the dark darker, and I'm also going to throw in some bright highlights. So I'm going to make the darker part darker right now, and then we'll come back later when it's all dry and we'll put in some highlight. So we're going to turn this from a fairly dull beetle to a more shiny. contrast. It's going to make a huge difference. What is the difference between the darkest dark and the lightest light? All right, so we'll come back to this little beetle at the end of the show. We'll add some highlights on it and we'll turn it into a very, very bright, shiny little beetle. That kind of like, maybe, you know, I think I want to punch the shadow in a little bit more underneath it. Yeah, there you go. All right, little beetle friend. So while this is drying, again, to put the highlight in, I'm going to be using gouache paint on it. If I did that right now, the gouache paint would just meld with the damp paint on top of it and make kind of a mucky gunk mark. So to avoid that, I'm just going to let this paper dry. So here's a little gouache palette. Oh my gouache. All right. And there's my water brush. I'm going to take some white. I'm going to take some white here. Let's get down on the beetle. Zoom. Zoom. No, that's not going to work. All right. So down on the beetle. All right. There's the beetle up close. And I'm going to. All right. The light will be hitting it on this side. So here's those little highlights. Bam, bam, bam. Oh, little bright beetle. All right, you're going to get some little highlights there. Here on your thorax, you're getting a little bit of special love there too, there on your head. All right. All right. So maybe I'm going to just put a little hint of that in there. All right. So a few little bright highlights, and we've turned dull beetle into shiny beetle, and it's ready to go on a little adventure and walk off your page. All right. Scuttle, 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 scuttle. There you have it. Just like that. A little bit more fun with shadow.